This is 9/11 Freefall.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of 9/11 Freefall. My name is Andy Steele, and I am the host. Tonight we'll be joined by Ansgar Schneider. He's a physics and mathematics scholar out of Germany, and his paper, The Structural Dynamics of the World Trade Center Catastrophe, is going to be presented very soon at the International Association for Bridge and Structural Engineering's annual conference in New York City. He'll be talking about that and how you can help send him there. So all that is coming your way tonight.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Alright, welcome back to the show, folks. So since tonight's guest paper focuses on the destruction of the North Tower, I thought it fitting to play one of the videos, one of many works out there that laid the foundation for this topic and really got people talking about this issue. People who follow this show, who follow AE 9/11 Truth, are going to know this video already. It's called Downward Acceleration of the North Tower. It's by David Chandler. This video runs about 3 minutes long. Once we play that, then we're going to start the interview. So let's listen.
This is the start of the collapse of World Trade Center number 1, also known as the North Tower. We are here tracking the motion of the roofline at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters, or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roofline as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First note that there is a sudden onset of collapse, as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall. In other words, once it starts falling, the upward resistive force is only 36% of the weight of the falling section of the building. So far, so good. But now turn it around. Newton's third law says interactions between objects work both ways. The forces two objects exert on each other are always equal and opposite. If the upward force acting on the falling block is 36% of the weight of the falling block, the downward force exerted by the falling block must be exactly the same, 36% of the weight of the falling block. In other words, the top section of the building is exerting less force on the lower, stronger, undamaged structure than it would if it were simply sitting motionless. Therefore, as long as the top section of the building is in uniform downward acceleration, it cannot possibly be providing sufficient force to destroy the building. This may seem counterintuitive to you. You might think a falling block coming down on the lower section of the building would exert a greater force than a stationary block. But that is true only if the falling block actually impacts the lower block, which would cause the falling block to decelerate. The only way the falling block can continue to accelerate smoothly, as we see here, is for the lower section of the building to give way without significant resistance. If this rate of acceleration continued all the way to the ground, the building would fall in about 11.5 seconds. This is close to the observed collapse time. So far I've been using the term block loosely. What we actually see here is the falling section of the building turning to dust before our eyes. But what is happening to the upper section of the building behind the dust clouds doesn't really affect this analysis. Given the fact that it is accelerating downward, the top section of the building, whatever its condition, cannot possibly be destroying the lower section of the building. The destruction of the building must be caused by something else.
We was in the lobby and then the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
Is that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
Floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
We have explosive demolition at not only the Twin Towers, but also Building 7.
For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
You want to call your mother or something?
It's just a matter of time. That's all it is. It's a matter of time and the persistence of those who continue to adhere to it and push for it. And that's what we're doing.
Tune in to 9/11 Freefall, a show about 9/11 truth, 9/11 science, and the activists and scholars who are blowing the lid off the crime of the century. You can download episodes at 911freefall.com. Ansgar Schneider got a diploma in physics in 2005 from Göttingen University and a PhD in mathematics from Göttingen in 2007. He's going to be doing something very important to our outreach efforts here to the professional community, and we are bringing him here on the show today to tell us more about that and himself. Ansgar, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me on the show.
No problem, and thank you for what you are doing here out in Germany and all over the world, bringing the information that you're bringing to the professional community that needs to hear it the most. So before we get into what you're going to be doing, tell us more about yourself and your professional background.
Well, from my educational background, I'm a physicist. I did my diploma in quantum field theory, and after having received my diploma in physics, I turned to mathematics. I was working in a theoretical mathematics, pure mathematics, for a couple of years then, in various universities and institutes. And so this was until 2014, and then, late 2014, beginning 2015, and it was at that time when I got first in contact with all the problems and all the unanswered questions about 9/11 and the three skyscrapers.
What got you interested in mathematics and physics to begin with?
I guess I was curious when I was little, understanding how nature is talking to us, or can we actually understand how nature is talking to us? Learning how to formulate all the undiscovered laws and forces of nature. So this is what kind of a naive childhood dream, to study physics and work in this field. And then later I turned to mathematics because I felt that I wanted to be a little more rigorous in a logical sense. In physics, you are sometimes, you start with, it's not logically compelling what you do, right? If you want to describe nature, you come up with an idea, you find a model, how to describe a certain phenomenon, and in mathematics, there isn't this arbitrariness is not there in mathematics so much. And I had the feeling that I need to know more about mathematics also to understand physics better, because in mathematical physics, you need a lot of mathematics, and I always had the need of really understanding everything, which not necessarily helps you to understand physics, because it's two different worlds. But, I was always interested in going to the details and going really to the end of the story, and so this is then why I changed from physics to mathematics, continued that for a couple of years, but then I eventually came back to physics, really, down to classical mechanics when I learned about these skyscrapers, or the first, the most astonishing thing that I ever heard in the past 18 years was when I first heard about Building 7, which of course is the most unbelievable thing you could probably imagine, particularly for a physicist. When you first hear that there's a skyscraper who's falling freely, I couldn't believe it. I was sure it's a joke when I heard it first time.
How did you come across this information? That's always very interesting to me to hear this story, and I want to see what has worked in the past. I mean, a lot of people just were surfing YouTube and came across a video by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth or some other group or individual, and that's how they first were introduced to the topic. What was it for you? What did you first see that got you thinking about this topic?
It was an email by a friend who is actually an astrophysicist, and he sent me an email about a talk, and someone was talking to me, and he was mentioning Building 7. And I had never in my life had heard about it before, and so I thought he must be joking. And then, of course, once you have heard the name, or once you have heard the context, you can Google, right? Or you can ask YouTube, show me a video of that thing. And then I think the first or second video which I saw was David Chandler's measurement of the acceleration of the downward movement of Building 7. And I couldn't believe it. I thought it's a hoax. I thought it's just someone has invented that this building went down somewhere, whatever. Apparently, or probably, it looked like an American city to me, like lots of tall buildings around. But I didn't know the New York skyline. And there was lots of dust, of course, and then I see this building disappear, and I thought, well, this certainly has been recorded somewhere in Chicago or Detroit, and they demolished an old building, and then the guy in the internet, he tells me this happened in 9/11. I really didn't believe that this happened. And, well, then after some time, of course, I realized that the person who was talking to me there, David Chandler, the measurement was clear, and he was so certain in what he said that this building indeed existed, that as a joke, it was somehow too good for a joke. And yeah, so then I started investigating whether this actually is true, and of course then you immediately realize it's true. But that does not necessarily mean that you realize or you become aware of all the implications of that. And for sure, it took, I don't know, a couple of months that I really dared to let further questions come up in my mind, or to just ask myself the question, why actually did the Twin Towers collapse, and all these questions which arise when you just when someone hits you and points in that direction and says, hey, here, look, right? So this never happened before, and well, I then started asking myself these questions, and now it's a couple of years later, but I think for most people this is still a completely unknown field, in particular in academia, I would say. I think in academia, people are very good sheltered somehow by media, by mass media. They trust mass media in the sense that they would get all necessary and important information adequately by the big newspapers, right? Which in Germany here, this is, for example, Zeit or Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. These are very influential newspapers, but they don't report about these issues. And so you don't really believe if you have never heard about that. And if it's not in the newspaper, you don't think it's true, because you think that's your pre-assumption. You think that at least everything important is mentioned, at least. And, well, apparently that's not the case. It's false. It's a false assumption about media. And that is, of course, the most or probably one of the most difficult things to digest, because somehow when you get this knowledge, then somehow your view of the world changes. And I think that's, for most people, that's the biggest hurdle to come over, to really accept.
Yeah, the tragedy happened on the day of September 11th, and then it continued for many years afterwards in terms of how in the dark so many people are, and then when this issue comes up, people who probably would have gotten along just fine with each other, had 9/11 not happened, now have this issue dividing them. So that's why we need to get at the truth of what really happened that day. And thanks to the efforts of people like you and so many others, we are getting closer to that. And we're going to talk about this paper that you are submitting to this conference. But before we do that, you didn't just wake up to September 11th recently. You've been speaking out about this issue for years. So previous to this current paper, what kind of work have you already published about the 9/11 science?
Yeah, I published 3 papers about the collapse of the North Tower. They're available in the archive ePrint server of Cornell University. It's the usual place where physicists and mathematicians put the papers before they appear in any sort of journal. That's standard business. So they're available there, and everyone can have a look at it. And some of them are very long. I mean, one is 10 pages, that's short. Another one is technical, and that is 20 pages, and the main paper is about 50 pages containing all the photographic evidence, the video footage which I analyzed about the collapse of the North Tower. And the condensed version of that is the paper that I submitted then to this conference. And it was reviewed by a blind peer review process, and they accepted it. And so I'm going to the conference to present the results in the talk there.
Right, and this is going to be the annual conference of the International Association for Bridge and Structural Engineering, the IABSE. And they cover a wide gamut of issues regarding structures. Obviously, bridges in the title, but they don't just focus on bridges, folks. They focus on buildings. And your paper is called The Structural Dynamics of the World Trade Center Catastrophe. And you will be presenting it there. And one of the great things about this, too, is that when you present at this conference, it's going to be published and available and on the record. So, Ansgar, please tell us what this paper is about.
There's a very short answer to that. You measure the downward movement of the tower, or the parts of the tower which move downward, and from that you can recompute the resistance by Newton's law. And what you then find is that the resistance changes through the process of collapsing. And you find that these changes are huge, and that the maximal value that appears is so huge that it would actually arrest the collapse. That, of course, means that there was some mechanism which reduced the resistance of the building during the time where not the maximal resistance force is found. And so the question is, what is that mechanism? That's the, in a nutshell, what it is about. So if I shall describe this in more detail, it starts with a series of papers by Bazant and some co-authors. They published a paper in early 2002 where they gave an estimate about the possible strength of resistance of the North Tower, and they concluded that, the strength of the columns was much too low to prevent the building from collapsing once the collapse has started. So they assume that maybe there's one floor failing, the columns in one floor are failing, and then what happens after that? And they concluded, the structure of the building was way too weak, or it was impossible for the building to resist the dynamical forces that come up due to the collapse, due to the movement from the top section, from the top segment, once it goes down. And then in 2000, I believe, 7 and 8, they published more papers on that, where they gave a more detailed, a more refined analysis. They wrote down the corresponding equations of motion for the whole collapse scenario. And this is, in a sense, they proposed a model for the collapse. A very simple model. It's easy. You could actually handle the model in second semester or third semester course in mechanics at university. It's very simple. And then they measured the rate of fall of the North Tower in the first 3 seconds or so. And they concluded, well, as you can see, the building collapsed, and here in the first 3 seconds it's easy to track the roofline because the roofline is still visible and didn't yet disappear behind the dust cloud. They concluded, well, the structural resistance was at a certain value according to our numerical analysis, and this value apparently was too small to resist or to arrest the fall once it had started. So this is what they did in 2007 and 8. And there is two things or three things that you should remark about that. The first thing is you do not know, when you measure the movement of an object, you do not know which forces are acting on that object, but you only know the overall force. So what I want to say is when you observe that the rate of fall for the North Tower has a certain value, you do not know whether the structure or the resistance of the tower is there completely or whether it has been reduced. You do not see that from the measurement. You only see that that the overall force of the measurement gives you a certain movement, but you do not know which forces actually are present in the process. And so even if you couldn't add any more research on that, the statement is quite weak because you do not know what's actually going on. You do not know the mechanism. And the second thing is something that I don't want to comment too much about it because it's rather technical. They did some partially very strange mistakes in their calculations. These mistakes turn out to be not very important as far as the numerical values, the numerical results are concerned, but somehow it's strange. I don't understand why they did these mistakes. So partially it looks to me as if they don't even understand their own model. But, I mean, it's a technical discussion, and I don't want to talk about this too much. I mean, those who are interested can go in the archive and look up the paper. And the third thing is, that is the most important thing. They only measured the measurement of the roof line in the first 3 seconds, but they didn't do anything else. But what you can do is, you can also measure the downward movement of the crushing front from below. So after 3.5 seconds, you don't see the roofline anymore. It disappears behind the dust cloud. You can track the antenna a little more because the antenna is visible, I think, up to 4-point-something seconds. And after that, nothing from the top segment is actually visible. We do not know whether the top segment is still there or not, whether it has been destroyed or not, because everything is behind the dust cloud. But what we can still do is we can measure the crushing front and the rate of movement of the crushing front, how fast it's going down. And when you do that carefully, then you notice that this was at some point in time after collapse initiation, say 7.7 seconds later, you recognize that the elevation of the crushing front at this time is 40 meters behind the point where it should be predicted by the movement from the first 3 seconds. So the crushing front lags behind its predicted value. The position of the crushing front lags behind its predicted value. And of course, 40 meters is a very significant distance. And if you imagine there's a whole building coming down on you, you can imagine that there is an extremely huge force that is needed to shift this part of the building that is coming down on you 40 meters up. And indeed, this force is so huge, so to slow down the movement so much that at 7.7 seconds there's this 40 meters difference, this force is so huge that this force would arrest the fall within the next 10 meters of movement or so. If this force would be homogeneously acting so continuously over this whole period of time and wouldn't stop, then the collapse would arrest. But apparently the collapse didn't arrest. And when you take further measurements, then you see again that the resistance force is again as low as it was in the beginning. So this tells us that, in principle, the structure of the building was strong enough to resist a collapse, even if the top segment of the building had gained a significant amount of momentum. So the statement of Bazant that a priori the structure was too weak, the statement is false. The structure was strong enough, and the question is what reduced the strength of the structure. I should remark here that in all of the analysis I assume that the collapse model which was proposed by Bazant and his co-authors describes indeed the whole process. That's an assumption, the model assumption, where you have to assume some model if you want to analyze it, if you want to analyze the collapse. And so modulo, of course, the technical mistakes they do, but this doesn't have a big numerical impact. You can just take the identical model of Bazant and you would get basically the same numbers. So this is described in more detail what is going on in the paper.
I agree with your analysis, and I read your paper the other day, and I even have some questions based off of it, just some questions that I've had regarding NIST analysis in comparison to what you have figured out. But I want to know, for the overall sake of the truth movement, and so they know exactly what you're presenting, boil it down. What are you bringing with this paper that's new to the argument that hasn't been covered previously by Chandler and all of the others?
It's new that if you assume the model of Bazant, you can show that during the process of collapse, a huge resistance force of the building was actually there. So Bazant published these papers, and they are pretty often quoted. It's kind of an error in the literature that has been there for a couple of years now, or for 18 years almost. So I'm showing that with the conclusion or the claim they make, that the structural resistance was a priori too weak, is false by their own model, in their own words, so to say. I say, okay, I accept what you propose, your model, and I make the analysis with that, and then I find, hey, what you said is false, because you didn't take all available empirical data into account.
Yeah, and that seems to be the overall theme of dealing with Bazant NIST, is that they did not take into account all of the data.
Yeah, there is a more philosophical, or more on a level behind. You should say that if you start analyzing what actually happened there, you, of course, should start from the basic observations, right? What you see in the videos and so on and so forth. And so just describe qualitatively what do you see. And after that, you would come up with a model. You should not write down, okay, here this is a model for a progressive floor collapse, and then let's apply it without looking actually at what we observe. Like, do we observe explosions? Do the eyewitness talk about explosions and all that? Which, of course, is important if you want to make a honest and thorough investigation. Of course, this all doesn't appear in Bazant's work. Right? He just proposes the model, makes his analysis based on the model, and gets a conclusion. Well, this conclusion is, let's say, correct for the first 3 seconds, but it doesn't tell you anything, because it doesn't tell you whether the force that he observed is the actual force by the building, or whether it's the force by the building reduced by something, by some mechanism, which he doesn't know, which I don't know. And it doesn't tell you, because he didn't take all empirical data into account, that at a later stage of the collapse, the force was actually bigger by a magnitude, by 1 order of magnitude. So that is, I mean, I think this is very important, because people tend to believe too much in mathematics, whereas they actually should first really make the basic observations, right? So how does it look like? Does it look like an ordinary, say in quotes, progressive floor collapse, or does it look like that the building is just pulverizing itself in an unbelievable manner? So these questions are not covered by the model. This is something that is beyond the model. The model itself is an assumption, and you can draw some conclusions from this model that is legitimate, but you should not believe that only things that are encoded in the model are somehow relevant to the truth of what was going on. Because in the model you only find things that you have that you put into the model from the outset. So you won't find anything that is not already in there. So by assuming the model, you kind of move around these phenomenological questions about what do you observe, how does it look like, the pulverization and all that, right? So you can make some conclusions from the model, but this conclusion is not what as I have shown, the conclusion is not the structure of the building was too weak, but the conclusion is the structure of the building was actually strong enough. And of course that changes the perspective on the model.
Now, in your view, given their mission, do you feel that it was scientifically responsible for NIST to simply focus on just the initiation of collapse and not the entire collapse itself?
Not at all. Because when you analyze the model, when you accept the model, and NIST refers to the very first paper of Bazant, where he said that the structure of the building was too weak once the collapse has started, it will continue. This is a statement of Bazant, and they cite him. And then they don't follow this question anymore. Of course, it's not enough to just say this is how the collapse initiated. This is two independent questions: whether the collapse initiates and whether it progresses. This is independent of each other. The statement of the paper is, indeed, the collapse should have stopped if this unknown mechanism, as I say, had not been there in the beginning and in the end. So certainly NIST did not do its job.
Now this paper is very fascinating, it's very technical for the layman, but you can get the overall point from listening to this discussion and from reading it yourself, which it will be available, especially once it's published by this organization. And I mentioned the organization earlier, the International Association for Bridge and Structural Engineering. They have an annual conference. It's in New York City this year. Right now we are raising $3,000. The major cost is for Ansgar to attend the conference, and there's also airfare and travel and lodging. And when he's down there, he's going to be distributing project due diligence flyers. He's going to get it out to 500 people. at this conference. And so those got to be printed as well. To get behind this and get this information in front of all of these engineers that are going to be attending this conference, you can go to ae911truth.org. You'll have received a bulletin on this by the time that you hear this episode. Just like previous fundraising efforts where we send our engineering activists to conferences, anyone who donates $20 or more is going to get 5 brochures sent to them, the brochures that will be distributed by Ansgar here. I mentioned the name of the organization in the conference, but please tell our audience a little bit more about it and about the process that you had to go through in order to get this paper approved so that you can present it there.
The association itself it's a huge international, very prestigious structural engineering association. The papers, they had a call for abstracts in the beginning of the year, and you could submit an abstract. Then the abstract was reviewed, and you got a decision about the abstract, whether the abstract is accepted. And then you had to submit a paper, which had a certain numbers of characters as a limit. I don't remember the number of characters. That's why the paper is so short compared to the original paper. And once the paper was submitted, they had a blind review process about the paper. It took a little longer than they actually had because apparently there was a lot of things to review. But eventually it got accepted, and without any further corrections or suggestions to me. That's the status now. I think they are now trying to come up with a schedule for the 3 days of conference, and I think there is a whole session called Forensic Study, Lessons Learning from the Past, or Learn from the Past, or something. And I'm in that session. So, but I think I'm probably, I don't know, but I'm the only one who's talking about the World Trade Center catastrophe.
And then this is going to be published, as I mentioned earlier, after you present it, correct?
Yeah, there will be conference proceedings published, and I don't know whether they will be available on the conference already, or whether that is published maybe in a couple of months after the conference. I don't know, but yes, it will be covered in the conference proceedings.
Well, I think this is great news. This is why we all got to get behind efforts like this. This is where the battle for 9/11 truth happens. It's happening in so many different theaters here. We've got the court cases that are going on. We've got the outreach from volunteers like Jack Buckland, who was on a week ago or 2 weeks ago, reaching out to presidential candidates. And we have the battle taking place in the academic world, where people like Ansgar here are presenting their scientific findings to others that should be reviewing this and chiming in on this debate. So again, if you want to donate to this effort, you can go to our webpage and get the truth before these people. Now, you're an academic, so I want your perspective on this. Considering the problems that you and so many others have outlined with Bazant's theory and NIST's reliance on it, why do you think, in your opinion, some other academics have refused to perform their own analysis and weigh in on this issue?
Yeah, this, I think, is, of course, a very important question, and but I also think that it's also very difficult to give a general answer to that, because of course the individual case is always more involved than let's say the average. But I think there are some general aspects. One major aspect, I think, is that most people still don't know. Like, I heard the first time about Building 7 in 2000 and, was it 14, end of 14, 15, something like this. So I think when I talk to my colleagues or so, then they don't know. So this is 18 years. And of course, when you are confronted with some sort of data that you have never heard about, data that are known for 18 years, you don't want to believe it. You don't trust the person. If you're used to mainstream media only, you don't trust the person who tells you that there is some very important data available that you should care about. When you trust mainstream media and this topic doesn't exist in mainstream media, then of course you can only conclude that the person who is telling you this empirical data or but the general facts about 9/11, you just don't believe it because you never heard about this in your favorite weekly or daily newspaper. So this, I think, is the biggest fraction of academics. They haven't even heard about it. And then maybe some have heard about it. Maybe they got an email from a friend like I got a couple of years ago, or a colleague is telling them, hey, have a look here. So what is the reaction? Of course, you then see it. You see, I was once talking to a colleague, and I forced him, while I was talking on the telephone, go on YouTube and watch the video about Building 7 collapsing, and he couldn't believe it as well. Like I couldn't believe it. So what happens then is, so either you start digging, why is this not in the media? Is it true? What happens? Like I did, because I had the time to do so. Or you don't do that because you just think that, well, if it's really true and if really this happened, then of course media would have taken on this issue, would have picked up the news, would have reported about it. Because you still believe that all important and necessary information you get from mainstream media. So this belief is very strong, I think. And even though if you don't have this belief, then you don't want to get involved into this kind of politics or things that are related to politics, because you just want to do what you like to do, like do your own research, think about the world, the structure of the world, physics or mathematics, prove your theorems. That's beautiful, that's nice. This is, well, where you have an expertise and so on and so forth. Many people do science because there's no politics involved, right? It's, in a sense, it's just, well, in quotes, true what you do because you just proved a theorem in mathematics or so. And that's beautiful to you. And you don't want to get involved in these nasty political debates whatsoever. So there's several reasons. Then it might be that, well, if you are on the way to become a professor and you don't have a permanent position yet, you think twice. Would it be a good idea to start talking about Building 7 in my position? Or would that be maybe not really helpful for my future career? A friend of mine, he's on a tenure track position, and he wanted to invite me to give a talk at university, and I said, well, let's wait until your position is permanent, right? So there are many reasons, and of course, it's if you then really open your mouth and start talking about this, it might be that you might earn one or the other shitstorm in the internet, or media might come and try to point out that you were just nuts, and all these experts who agree that the NIST report has solved all unsolved questions and so on and so forth. So you might feel very uncomfortable in really talking about it. It's a question of power structure in society, and people in academia are just ordinary people as everywhere in the world, and as everywhere in society, and they're not more courageous than the ordinary person on the street. In fact, they are more more easy to influence or more easy to manipulate as, let's say, the ordinary person on the street, because they have the strong belief in the system or so, because from their perspective, the system works very well, like they got all this career and all the success they had from their own creativity and their own effort, which they put into their jobs and in the papers they wrote and all this. So from their perspective, this is a very good system and everything is fine, and you just can't believe that such a nasty thing happens. So I think there isn't an easy answer to that question, but I think one major point is just that the belief system is changed, and that hurts. If you really are focused with the insight that what you have believed for all these years is not true, that media is working accurately and that politics works accurately as you think, and so on. So, because if this is true, then from your self-understanding of being an academic, being an intellectual person, you, of course, would expect from yourself that you stand up and shout out, hey, here we have a threat to democracy and to freedom of speech and so on and so forth. But of course, that's less uncomfortable. That's less comfortable. It's uncomfortable for the person who is doing that.
Looking up your history here in preparation for this interview, I see that you have a book. The English translation of the title is Stigmatization Instead of Investigation. And that's what I think about when I hear you speaking on this matter. Can you tell our audience what that book overall is about and some of the conclusions that you reach in it?
Yeah, so I wrote this book. So it was published last year. I wrote it for myself in a sense. But when I learned the facts about the buildings and the various studies that have been made, I kind of started listing up the most important, which appeared to me the most important issues. And because I was observing that in media, the debate about that didn't take place. So the book is about two things. Firstly, it summarizes the scientific evidence about what is known about the collapse of the three towers, and it also gives a review about the media response to this scientific evidence. And that response, of course, is very poor. Actually, it doesn't exist at all. So you don't find, in the whole German-speaking region, you won't find a single article or TV program whatsoever where there is an accurate description about what is known about the science of the collapse of the three towers. So this is, you don't have words for that. This is a complete media blackout. And I observed that while I was listening to the radio, and there were academics on the radio, and they were talking about 9/11, but they didn't even mention that Building 7 was in free fall whatsoever, and they denied that even. And they came up with the term conspiracy theory, which is a totally pseudo-scientific term. There is no scientific definition of that term, although there is a big industry in academia who is trying to establish the term as an academic notion. However, all the attempts fail to stand, to actually get the examples which are treated as so-called conspiracy theories in media. So in media, I didn't really study the English-speaking media about that, but I think it's the same as far as I saw from reading a couple of articles and reflecting the debate a little bit. But I didn't go into, I didn't study that in detail too much. But in the German-speaking region, in media, there are three branches of, topics which are covered by the term conspiracy theory. And the first part is something that is completely pseudoscientific or just fantastic constructions about, let's say, aliens. So completely strange stories which you would find in cinema. So this is one branch that is covered with this term. The other branch is some sort of racist ideas about society or anti-Semitic ideas about society. And there you see already that this is two completely independent subjects. One is racism, the other one is pseudoscience or science fiction or like crazy stuff that doesn't really have you can't even grasp it. And then there's this third part. And the third part is, well, anything that questions, let's say, the general official statements about, let's say, the American government or the German government or, let's say, any of the NATO allies of the Western community. So whenever you have a doubt that, let's say, some crime that was committed, maybe was a crime committed by the state, then they also call it conspiracy theory. And of course, because when you use a term like this, and it has this connotation of pseudoscience, racism, and then you come up with something that has nothing to do with the other two subjects, but you give it the same name, then of course this is scientifically unacceptable. Because you manipulate the person you're talking to think in these categories of racism or pseudoscience, although he's just talking about a crime. Like 9/11 was a crime. 3,000 people, almost 3,000 people got murdered, and you want to know, well, who did this crime? And what actually was the crime? Was it just 4 airplanes? Or was it maybe something else? Was it that the buildings were, destroyed intentionally? Did the buildings just collapse by themselves? You want to know. You want to discuss this. This is questions everyone should raise about a crime if you want to investigate this crime. And so if you then, from this perspective, criticize the official reports about that, then they would say, okay, this is conspiracy theory. The intention of that is, of course, to construct some sort of taboo that the reader or the person who is listening is immediately aware that whatever comes now must be either racist or pseudoscientific or whatever. So this is the 3 branches that are covered by this term conspiracy theory. And now it's absolutely unscientific to come up with the idea that you could give this name, this notion, a scientific meaning, because you cannot take a word that doesn't have a meaning and has this negative connotation, and has these negative connotations, and then give it a scientific neutral meaning. It's impossible. It's like the term idiot. You cannot give the term idiot a neutral meaning. To say that this group of persons, this group of people we call them idiots, but not, of course, in the way as usually people use the word idiot to insult the people, but we use it neutral to describe some properties of these people. It doesn't work. You cannot use an insult as a scientific notion. It's a long story. But I observed that media uses this term heavily. I wasn't aware of, I heard this name before, of course, but for me it was always something that actually, it doesn't exist in an honest, real debate in society. This was just something that, I don't know, maybe like cinema or something in my mind, you know? But then in media it really comes up heavily in regard to this 9/11 issue. So this is the other part of the book, to look at what media is doing there. It's like Orwell. They're creating a language where by the terms and language they use, the truth or the content of a certain question or statement is encoded, not by the content itself, but how they label it. And that, of course, is dangerous. This is a direct threat to democracy and freedom of speech.
Well, I'll tell you what, it's something that a lot of us have observed, and I think it's something that we are overcoming because of efforts like yours, efforts like those in the audience who continue to do the outreach, and we're going to keep on going, and we will overcome this, and at some point it will be stigmatized not to question 9/11 all over the world because it's becoming more obvious to people that we've been lied to about that day and that a new investigation is needed. And unfortunately, we are out of time today, so Ansgar Schneider, good luck at the conference, and thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Freefall today.
Thanks again, Andy.
This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.